Hi everyone. Stash build number 8 was supposed to be the 20th scale Gustav kit from the Machine & Krieger series. Unfortunately, one of the sprue trees provided in the kit was completely wrong, which meant I had to reorder another whole new kit all the way from Japan. So, while we wait for the replacement kit to arrive, I decided to skip to the next kit on the summit of Stash Mountain. Next in line was the 1 to 35 scale master box set of figurines, which was simply titled Accident. I have mentioned before that I'm a big fan of master box figurines. On the sunny side, the figures are, as always, nicely detailed. One of the figures even has a replacement head, arms and rifle, so that he can be built in either a passive or aggressive pose. Several extra items of equipment are included, which would go a long way to add some interest to a diorama. The painting guide is for Vallejo colors, and is very concise, which makes the task of paint selection very easy. On the shady side, the figures all had those ubiquitous seam lines, which require extensive cleanup. A couple of the uniform colors didn't look quite right and needed to be changed. The kit did not include the motorcycle and sidecar depicted in the box art in front, which was a pity, but then again, it was only supposed to be a figurine set in the first place. The reason I wax lyrical about masterbox kits is that they usually depict some eye-catching subject matter while telling a small story at the same time. For this reason, I'm going to give this kit a worthy rating of 4 golden ostrich eggs. The front box art is really professional and is a great starting point to help someone plan their final diorama. The back of the box serves as an instruction guide, as the various parts which make up each figure are clearly numbered. The sprue tree is illustrated in great detail, and right next to it is a comprehensive paint guide for all the colors needed to add some life to these little guys. Inside the box is a single large sprue tree which is wrapped neatly and securely. The various parts which make up each figure are generally grouped together on subsections of the sprue to make each one easier to assemble. The detail of individual pieces is very good, and one can clearly see the fold lines in the clothing and the expressions on the small faces. Painting these figures is always a lot of fun, and the more time and effort one puts into the task, the better the end result will be. Of course, to complete the diorama, we're going to need a crashed vehicle to make it work. For this reason, we're going to build another kit from Stash Mountain, namely the Tamiya Kubelwagen TYpe 82, obviously also in 35 scale. The word Kubelwagen loosely translates as bucket of bolts from the German language, which is a bit unfair as this vehicle was quite reliable and versatile. Tamiya kits are always well detailed and easy to modify, so this will round off our tiny vignette quite nicely. The sprue trees were neatly packaged in plastic bags, and unlike the Gustav kit, all the parts were correct. Strangely, the windshield was nothing more than a flexible sheet of plastic, which was rather unique. The one time we don't really need a figure, the kit comes with quite an awesome one, complete with African safari shorts and a peaked cap. We'll have to use this particular figure in another build sometime in the future. The rest of the parts were true to the usual high standards which are characteristic of Tamiya kits. The smaller parts were nicely detailed and would be easy to paint. The decals were also very crisp and clear. By the way, in case you were wondering, this kit gets a rating of 3 golden ostrich eggs. It loses an extra egg for not having the right decals for a vehicle with a grey color scheme. I built the figures one by one. By following the guide on the back of the box, I cut off and cleaned all of the individual parts, working on one figure at a time to avoid making any mistakes with the body parts. The easiest way to remove the seam lines was to use an X-Acto knife with a brand new blade and carefully scrape off the offending seam line while trying not to lose any of the detail of these small parts. It was slow going, but eventually all of the figures had been put together and were ready to receive their coat of primer. After a quick coat of Tamiya grey primer, the figures were pinned to small bases, which would help to hold them steady while they were painted. Smaller parts of equipment which needed to be painted separately were attached to the end of toothpicks to make life easier. To start with, all of the figures received an initial coat of paint using the colors indicated on the painting chart. After this step, the figures all looked unnaturally bright and colorful and a bit rough around the edges, but all of these colors would be toned down and blended in the next few steps. After a coat of gloss varnish, a wash was applied to the figures and their equipment. The wash settled into the recesses and created darker areas which simulated natural shadows and helped bring out a lot of the detail in the figurines. The last step was to add some color to accentuate the highlights in the clothing and on the faces. I built up several thin layers of lighter shades of paint until I had a result which looked fairly good to my eye. I always add my primer coats out of doors, as the stuff is pretty noxious and creates a fine cloud of paint particles which settle all over the place, not to mention what it would probably do to a person's lungs. I misted a light primer coat on all the parts of the Tamiya Kubelwagen, making sure to spray from all angles to get full coverage of the surface detail. The base coat dries fairly quickly and one can continue with the build after about 15 minutes of drying time. I masked off certain sections of the sprue trees in order to leave the parts of the model exposed which would receive a coat of German grey. This was the standard colour of the vehicle while it was in service as a staff car by the German forces in Europe during the Second World War. The undercarriage of the vehicle was nicely detailed. I was glad about this, as the underside would be featured quite prominently in the final diorama. I painted the engine parts according to the instructions and glued on the mufflers and other finer details to the model. I assembled the upper part of the vehicle carefully and attached this to the completed chassis. Next, I applied a dark tone wash to the underside of the vehicle, including the engine. This brought out the details of the undercarriage and darkened it quite nicely. To finish up, I added all of the tires to the car. Once the glue had cured, I added the seats, windshield, steering wheel and doors, and the Kubelwagen was done. I decided early on that a diorama base would be a fun way to add value to the build. After sculpting a few raised features on a small wooden base with some foam board, I mixed up a quick batch of woodland scenic plaster. This was applied to both the foam board features and the dirt road and allowed to dry. The base was given a coat of flat earth paint and then, using some scenic glue, a sprinkling of brown tile grout was added to some parts of the base to give it more texture. The dirt road needed a little texture too. I applied some scenic glue to that part of the base and added some coarse turf to simulate a gravel road. Everything was sealed in with a final quick spray of scenic glue and allowed to dry. After painting some areas with Mod Paste, I used a homemade static grass applicator to add some greenery to the base. A few tufts of grass and some small flowers were also glued on random areas. This added a bit of extra visual interest to the depicted scene. To round things off, I attached some small stones which I collected from the garden to the sides of the road. They were painted and then given a dark wash to blend them in with the rest of the background scenery. I drilled some holes into the base and pinned each figure into position. And with that, I'm calling it done. 2 more kits from Stash Mountain came together, and the result was a really fun build. So long, and thanks for watching.